It's my great pleasure to welcome my dear friend, Professor Larry Diamond. In fact, for people in Denver and also at Cobell School, he is not a stranger at all. He has been here quite a few times. The last time was 4 years ago. That has been too long. And in fact, I still remember when he was called by Condoleezza Rice to go serve in Iraq that year. He was in Denver.
I was basically within a quarter mile of where
right
we are now.
Here. And from that experiences, he came back, write a very popular, I would say, book. Some people don't like it, Squandered Victory, American occupation of Iraq. In fact, remember that his travel expenses were not reimbursed by the State Department because of that book. So he talked to our dean now to get that money back. And Dr. Larry Diamond has been known in the whole world as a Mr. Democracy, because his writings on democracy in the whole world has been really well known in both U.S. and outside of U.S. I cannot track how many books he has published. The most recent book is The Global Struggle for Democracy as a Civil Society. And he has been talking to several places this trip in Denver. So he's been somehow very, very full schedule. So we are so grateful that he can take time off of this full schedule to come to the University of Denver, which I think is the best place in the whole Colorado. So he should be here. And also I'm so glad to see some of my colleagues, my faculty members here at school. Normally they don't come to our events. So because Larry, I see colleagues, quite a few, yeah. See how appealing he is. So we are so grateful. Without further ado, please join me to welcome Dr. Larry Diamond.
Should I use the microphone?
Whatever you feel comfortable.
I think you can hear me without the mic. Is that okay? So I'll use that so I can actually see what's going up on the screen. Okay. Well, I guess that settles it. Thank you for the warm introduction, Sam. It's always great to come back here and be at the University of Denver. I have very high esteem for your faculty and students, and I've always had really great interactions with them. I think this is maybe my 4th time speaking here in my career. But in any case, today I want to, of course, it's a bit of a timely subject to think about the state of democracy in the world with the extraordinary outpourings of democratic mobilization and frustration that have taken place in so many countries in recent months, including virtually all of the countries that were in the documentary film that I made about the global struggle for democracy, A Whisper to a Roar. And we looked at 5 countries: Ukraine, Egypt, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, and Malaysia. 4 of the 5 have been very prominently in the news recently, and the other one, Malaysia, came very close to having a breakthrough to electoral democracy in their most recent national elections, where the opposition coalition gained very significantly at the polls. So today I want to kind of review the global state of democracy and respond to the thesis that is certainly out there and is evident in a lot of contemporary journalistic as well as academic writing. It kind of runs through the recent cover story in The Economist magazine about whether democracy is globally in decline. It's certainly globally under challenge. So that is what I want to interrogate. I don't think I need to define electoral democracy for a university audience like this, or really liberal democracy, but I do want to stress that in order to understand what is happening in the world, we do need to make a distinction between the minimal level of electoral democracy where people can choose and replace their leaders in free and fair elections, and a deeper level of, or higher quality of democracy, which I think has long been understood under the term liberal democracy, which combines the elements of popular sovereignty, vertical accountability, majority rule, and the elements of liberal governance in terms of protection from minority rights, extensive freedoms, political equality, a strong civil society, a civic culture, and then the Republican element of good governance in terms of control of corruption, rule of law, a strong and independent architecture of horizontal accountability. And you'll see these two dimensions running through a number of my slides. So I think you know all of this about the third wave of democracy and the various thresholds that have been reached during this 40-year period of expansion of democracy. And the fundamental point to be stressed here and then in the graph to follow is that there was this continuous and impressive expansion of democracy, the great burst of democratic progress after the end of the Cold War, and then really a leveling off of democratic progress since 2005. And since 2005, unfortunately, the slides are a bit difficult to see. I don't know if the lights can be turned off. If they can be, the slides will be more visible. This is 2005. It's really an important inflection point because after, I think, as with democracy in the world, that's moving us in the wrong direction. But in any case, you can see that the level of, that's great, the level of democracy in the world reached a higher watermark of 63% of all the independent states of the world in 2005. With the growth in the number of democracies in the last year, according to Freedom House, we added 4 democracies. We've come close to that, but really, in terms of electoral democracy, there hasn't been any net progress in the last 8 years. In terms of liberal democracy, and the way I'm distinguishing liberal democracy here is just to take all the countries in the world that get one of the 2 best scores on the 7-point scales of political rights and civil liberties that Freedom House assesses every year for all the countries in the world, and identify those countries that get a 1 or a 2 on the 7-point scale of political rights and a 1 or a 2 on the 7-point scale of civil liberties as reasonably liberal democracies. And here you see that there's been a steady increase as well, worth noting, in the number of liberal democracies in the world, but that as well kind of leveled off and even declined slightly after 2005. And the high water mark of 46% still hasn't been recovered. You also see a significant gap. There are about 79 liberal democracies in the world today. By that admittedly rough and imperfect calculation, and roughly I estimate, mainly using the Freedom House criteria, which I think are rather too generous sometimes, about 120 democracies in the world. That means there are 40 democracies in the world where the rule of law is not very good, where corruption is really extensive, and where democracy is insecure as a result of that. And that's the theme I'm going to return to. Liberal democracy as well has expanded in the world, and you can see the different dimensions that I stress. And I do want to underscore as well that if you use this criterion of a 1 or a 2 on each of the 2 scales, you still get a lot of countries like Romania and Brazil where the situation is not very pretty, frankly, where there's still a lot of police abuse, control of local populations by political bosses, abuses of human rights, significant and in some countries really disturbing levels of corruption. So I'm not saying that at the lower end of the spectrum in particular that these liberal democracies, as I am classifying them, don't still have very significant problems. And of course, even the democracies that have the best scores on the Freedom House scale, at least in the more generalized 7-point scale, because Freedom House has a finer point scale that's more discriminating, and that includes the United States, which gets a 1 and a 1 on these two scales. We know, as I'll underscore toward the end of this lecture, we have really serious and I would say growing problems of democratic quality in the United States and in some of the other established democracies. So during this period, I think you all know, one of the striking things about it is that democracy has become a global phenomenon, that there has emerged a critical mass of democracies, as you can see here, in every region of the world except one, and of course that is the Middle East, where the only 3 electoral democracies in the world, in the Arab world or in the Middle East today, not only the Arab world, but the entire Middle East and North Africa, are Israel, Turkey, and the first emerging democracy in the Arab world, at least since the Lebanon Civil War, and that is Tunisia. And I'm going to come back to that because I think the emergence of Tunisia as a democracy likely to be crystallized in elections by the end of this year under the new constitution that's recently been agreed upon is an extremely significant historical development, not only for the Arab world, but globally. And this is the distribution of regimes in terms of number of countries and then in percentage of states within each region. And you see that in Latin America and the Caribbean, most of the region is democratic, but I'm going to come back to this. If you add the Caribbean, then 2/3 of the states can be classified now in this very rough way as liberal democracies. And then this declines in the Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. Here you get a break where, and it's a break that's evident in Ukraine today, where Central and Eastern Europe leans in the liberal direction. The former Soviet Union, minus the Baltic states, has had a lot of trouble making democracy work and has become really pretty seriously and in some cases increasingly authoritarian. There's only a few liberal democracies in Asia, like Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. And in sub-Saharan Africa, about 37% of the 49 states, that's 18 of the 49 in sub-Saharan Africa, could be classified as electoral democracies. But one of the points I would note that is sobering is, first of all, how much the slippage has been since the mid-1990s, when fully half of the then 48 states of sub-Saharan Africa could be classified as democracies. And second of all, how many of these, quote, democracies, including countries like Kenya, Malawi, Zambia, are really very, very questionable and ambiguous in their extent of democracy and frankly moving in the wrong direction. These are the trends in terms of levels of freedom in the world between 1974, when the third wave of democratization began, and the end of last year, 2013, when Freedom House issued its most recent report. And of course, as you move up toward 1, as I said before, this is averaging the 2 scales of political rights and civil liberties, freedom increases. And what you see here again is that 2005 is a kind of inflection point. And after this, levels of freedom tend to decline, not dramatically. In fact, it's very hard to see to the naked eye, but there's certainly been no progress, and there's been a slight and steady regression, both for the world as a whole, and if you separate out the developing and post-communist states, for that majority of states in the world outside the advanced industrialized democracies. Then if you decompose the data regionally, you find, again, some regression, but more strikingly, very different regional patterns. So if you look at Latin America and the Caribbean, you see that there was not dramatic, but steady progress toward greater political and civil freedom. And in Central and Eastern Europe, you see the most dramatic progress of any region in the world. And by Central and Eastern Europe, I'm really including now only the post-communist countries that that were not part of the former Soviet Union, almost all of which have now been incorporated into the European Union. And they went from being the least free region of the world, along with the former Soviet Union, to being the most free region of any region outside Western Europe, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. Then there's been some gradual improvement in the Asia-Pacific region, but this is actually the region that has probably experienced less change than all the others. Quite dramatic improvement in sub-Saharan Africa, but again, around 2000, 2004, a decline, and a rather noticeable one. Dramatic improvement in the former Soviet Union, and then quite a steady decline. And the red line is for the Middle East and North Africa, which began as not the most repressive region of the world in the 1970s, slightly better than Africa and better than the communist states, but has stagnated in a way that the other regions have not, and is now tied with the former Soviet Union for the worst average freedom scores of any region in the world. And I'm going to come back to the Arab world and the Arab Spring in a little while and ponder that. So my main point, and it was a point I made when I published The Spirit of Democracy in 2008, and now it's a point that's much more widely accepted than it was when I was making the argument back in 2005, 6, 7, and 8, is that we are in a period, we've been for some time now, certainly as you see from the data, at least since 2005, in a period of a mild political recession of democracy. This predates the global economic recession of 2008, 2009, and it is a recession that is political in nature and has some of the following features. First of all, as you saw, democratic progress in net terms basically stopped in 2005. Second of all, we've now had, as Freedom House notes, 8 consecutive years in which the number of countries declining in their levels of freedom have significantly outstripped the number of countries that have been gaining in their levels of freedom. And of course, in any given year, most countries don't change in their political rights and civil liberties. But a number do change, and for the last 8 years, in most of these years, at least twice as many countries have declined in freedom as have improved. And here you see those numbers. The 0.5 indicates that this is the ratio of gains to declines. So when you're at 0.5, twice as many countries are declining as are gaining. And that's basically been the pattern for the last 8 years, whereas in most of the years from 1991 to 2005, 1.5 to 2 times or more as many countries were gaining as declining in freedom. So quite, again, an inflection point right around 2005, beginning with the year 2006. And then, as I've noted, there's been a significant decline of democracy in Africa. It's not surprising if you're a modernization theorist like I am, then you would expect that the region of the world where democracy would be most fragile would be the region with lowest per capita income, lowest levels of education, as a result, the weakest political institutions and the greatest political institutional stresses. But in a region of significantly greater per capita income, Latin America, we've also seen, I think, some underappreciated erosion of democracy. It's not just the strangulation of democracy in Venezuela by Hugo Chavez, the continuing problems in Central America, particularly Honduras, the suffocation now, I think we can say, of electoral democracy by Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, but a lot of pressure on democratic institutions and values by similarly powerful populist presidents in Bolivia and Ecuador. Certainly a project that was trying to move Argentina in that direction by the President Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner. I think she's failed, and Argentina is about to turn in a somewhat better direction. But the institutions of that region have been under assault, and the Organization of American States has been, I'd say, notably ineffective and apathetic in dealing with this democratic erosion. And then, by and large, the failure, though not the complete failure, of the Arab Spring. So, you know, you look at it regionally, and it's a worrisome picture. And then, of course, you look in post-Soviet space, and you see the shadow, if not the domineering presence of Vladimir Putin and of Russian-style authoritarianism throughout the region. So that's not all that we should be worried about. If you actually do as I did and perform a meticulous coding of all the regimes in the world, and then look at when and where reversals of electoral democracy have happened and track this through the whole 40-year period of the third wave, you find a surprising empirical pattern. At least it was somewhat surprising to me, and I was prepared for somewhat sobering news. First of all, there have been a lot of breakdowns of democracy, as you'll see in a minute. And about half of all the breakdowns of democracy that have occurred in this 40-year period have occurred just in the last 13 years since the year 2000. When the rate of democratic breakdown, as you'll see in a moment, has been significantly higher than in the previous periods of the third wave. And a number of these breakdowns have come in big and very strategically important countries: Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Venezuela, the Philippines, Russia, and so on. Now, in some cases, democracy is returned, but, you know, in a state in Pakistan and Kenya, for example, that is somewhat ambiguous. And to add to the shadow of authoritarian progress, if you want to put it in those terms, or the more dynamic character of authoritarianism than democracy now, you have a growing sense in the world that democracies are not very capable of solving their problems, that maybe they are revealing their intrinsic weaknesses. And to quote Tom Friedman, maybe a lot of countries should think about being China for a day, or for a month, or for a year, or for a generation, or more. And a lot of African leaders, of course it's very self-serving for them, are saying, well, you know, China's working pretty well, we need a strong hand, maybe we should follow the China model. I'll respond to this in a minute, but it doesn't help that a lot of countries in the world, including even some democracies, but mainly authoritarian states, are cracking down on civil society and criminalizing, as Venezuela, Ethiopia, Russia, and other countries have done, international flows of financial and technical assistance to civil society organizations. And I think one of the most important and damaging features of the current period of democratic doubt and decay that we are in is the poor performance of democracy in our own country, the United States, and in other advanced industrialized democracies like Europe and Japan. So here are some data on the breakdown of democracies during this 40-year period of the third wave of democracy. There have been, by my count, I don't say it's perfect, but I've tried to parse the data as conscientiously as possible. If you go back to 1974 when the third wave began, there have been 33 breakdowns of democracy with the subsequent return to democracy. And these are some examples while trying to mainly note the more recent cases. And then there have been another 23 instances in which democracy is broken down, but there's been no return to democracy, including a number of instances where the breakdown happened not as a result of a military intervention, but a gradual deterioration in freedom and accountability, and a gradual, as I've already said, strangulation by ruling executives of political and civic space and of mechanisms of accountability and of civil and political freedom and the rule of law that became, as in Sri Lanka, as in Nicaragua, as in Venezuela much earlier, so severe that it just reached the point where I think no really independent-minded observer could really call the system a democracy any longer. And the date at which you mark that descent below the threshold of electoral democracy, I think could be debated, but the fact of it, I think, would be very difficult to debate. And so this is the other sobering set of statistics for me about democratic breakdowns. First of all, if you count up all the failures of democracy that have occurred during this 40-year period, it's a lot. 1 out of every 3 democracies that has existed in this period, and I count 170 of them because you've had multiple attempts in some countries, 1 out of every 3 democracies that has existed in this period has failed. And of course, if you separate out Western Europe, Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, the advanced industrial democracies, the failure rate has been much higher in the emerging and developing democracies of the world. And then the other point is, if you trichotomize this 40-year period or 39-year period since 1974 into 3 roughly 13-year slices, what you see is that the last 13-year slice has been much more fragile than the other 2, with 19% failure rate as opposed to a little less than 13% before that and 16% in the first period of the third wave. So rising incidence of democratic failure. And why is this happening? Well, I had a hunch that, looking at the data, that if you went back in time from the date of democratic failure and looked at the trends in terms of political rights and civil liberties, you would see a process of decay of democracy before the demise of democracy. Now, to some extent, that's true almost by definition when you see a gradual strangulation of democracy in a place like Russia, Sri Lanka, or Venezuela. But it's true also in countries that have experienced sudden breakdowns by military coup. And what you see is that political rights in particular seem to decline between the period of 3 years before the breakdown through to the period of the breakdown rule. And also you see some gradual decline in civil liberties. And this is just kind of pointing toward where I'm headed, which is something I kind of grasped or at least theorized quite a large number of years ago when I was writing my previous book that was published in 1999 called Developing Democracy. There seems to be a very strong relationship between the quality of democracy and the stability or consolidation of democracy. You see this in 2 respects. First of all, if we look at political legitimacy as an important indicator of the consolidation of democracy, the durable, multidimensional, sustained levels of support for democracy can be taken as an extremely revealing indicator of the consolidation of democracy. And also just you can look at the survival of democracy, and by either criterion, you see that the more liberal a democracy, the higher the quality of democracy, both as revealed by the Freedom House data and by other independent qualitative and quantitative indicators of the depth and quality of democracy, are strongly positively associated with the consolidation of democracy and the survival of democracy. The more liberal democracy, the more likely it is to survive. The more illiberal and abusive an electoral democracy is, the more vulnerable it is to break down. So now I will answer the question you have probably had in mind: why have there been so many breakdowns of democracy? And basically I identify 5 reasons that are strongly interrelated. The most common one, the one that runs through virtually every instance, is a weak rule of law coupled with the second factor of executive abuse of power. So you see extensive corruption and abuse of constitutional principles, a lot of self-seeking by political parties and ruling politicians, abuse of individual rights, impunity for the state and non-state actors that are committing these often violent abuses of civil liberties, and often a very extensive climate of criminality, lawlessness, and abuse of constitutional principles. Then as well you find that a lot of these societies, most of these countries, are complex countries in terms of ethnic, religious, regional, linguistic differences. One of the biggest challenges for the democracy in the world, I think it's one that you have seen, Ambassador Hill, in your own work, is managing diversity and often deeply polarized identity divisions. And if countries don't develop effective institutions, and I think federalism is a very important institution where these identities are territorially distributed for managing this diversity, and if they don't push forward political leaders with the intelligence, restraint, and kind of political savvy to build broad and inclusive political coalitions, which is a very important issue in Ukraine right now, then you're going to get polarization and stress on the political system and a greater likelihood of breakdown. In most of these instances of democratic failure, you find weak and ineffective political institutions. Now, to some extent, that goes with the terrain of newly emerging democracies, but particularly newly emerging democracies in the context of poverty and weak states. You've got a much better chance at sustaining a democracy if it emerges as a result of authoritarian success rather than authoritarian failure. Because when you get a democracy emerging in South Korea, in Taiwan, I think it's going to happen before too long in Singapore, in Spain, and so on, then you've got what Linz and Stapon called a usable state. In fact, a pretty developed state. So you don't have to worry about the simultaneous challenge of state building. You have a developed economy that's performing pretty well, and the institutions are in place to sustain economic growth. You get democracy emerging after state failure in a place like Liberia or Sierra Leone, or struggling to emerge in Afghanistan or Iraq, obviously not successfully yet in either case. It's a big challenge. Now, if it's a small country, you get enough aid. The aid is conditional. Leaders have to act with a certain amount of restraint. The aid also empowers civil society. You've got a chance at propelling it along in a place like Sierra Leone or Liberia. But neither country is in a very secure place democratically right now. Each is experiencing some worrisome signs of erosion in the quality of democracy and governance, and it just underscores my point. And finally, poor economic performance. I do want to underscore that there is, as Seymour Martin Lipset, who was my mentor, underscored in his path-breaking work in Political Man, a very important relationship early on between government performance and the formation of beliefs about the legitimacy of the regime that's in place. And so when government performs well, it can legitimate a regime and sustain it through a fragile early period of its life. But these beliefs or evaluations of performance are not only economic, they are very significantly political. And we now have just an absolute wealth of survey data from the different regional barometers, the Afro barometer, the Asian barometer, the Latino barometer, surveys that have been done in Central and Eastern Europe to show that people's evaluations of levels of corruption, fidelity to the rule of law and constitutional principles, executive restraint in exercising power, levels of freedom, and so on. These are extremely important in the formation of judgments about the legitimacy of the new regime, and in many cases are more important than people's evaluations of economic performance. But it's not to say that economic performance doesn't matter. And certainly in the medium run, if government performs very badly and there's no progress in lifting people out of poverty, and there's no general economic growth, or economic growth happens in a way that's mainly captured by a privileged and narrow political class, it will undermine support for democracy. This is a slide that shows the point I was making about the relationship between political performance and democratic viability. What I've done here is I've taken the two scales of political rights and civil liberties of Freedom House and used the finer raw point data that they make available on their website to decompose them into three scales: political electoral rights, civil liberties, and transparency in the rule of law, which includes control of corruption, judicial independence, and so on. And you see here why sub-Saharan Africa has experienced such dramatic erosion of democracy in the last 7-8 years. Political and electoral rights have been declining, but you know, they've been, if you take the 7-point scales and normalize them on a 0 to 100 scale, they've been about the midpoint. Civil liberties have been declining visibly, but again, they're at around the midpoint on the 7-point scale. But on the dimension of transparency and the rule of law, this is where African countries have performed the worst, and there's been, again, very visible decline. And I can just reduce it to this: corruption, corruption, corruption. It's like location, location, and location. If you can control corruption, abuse of power, self-dealing, lack of respect for the rules of the game, you got a much better chance at sustaining democracy, and it's very hard to do. So let me conclude with a few final thoughts. First of all, some of the other reasons why I'm concerned about the state of democracy in the world is that this problem is really spinning out of control in India. Corruption in the last 5, 6, 7 years in India has really reached virtually, if you'll forgive this expression, Nigerian levels of predatory theft of public resources. And this is why you've seen the rise of various civil society movements mobilizing hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, and a new citizens' party, the Aam Aadmi Party, that could make very significant gains in the elections that are coming this May. And the general pervasiveness and tenacity of corruption around the world is something that I think we really need to worry about. Moreover, Africa is on the cusp of one of the biggest oil booms that will probably happen anywhere in the world in the next 20 years. Quite a number of countries running through the Rift Valley of East Africa and the Bight of Benin and the Gulf of Guinea in West Africa are about to become, over the next 10 years, as Ghana has already become, significant oil exporters. And if they don't figure out a way to get better management in the extractive industries sector, better governance and control of corruption, I fear that even in countries that are doing okay, like Ghana, like Senegal, and so on, as democracies, it just may overwhelm the quality of governance and the incentive structure. And I've already spoken about the ambiguous extent of democracy in many of the countries classified by Freedom House as democracies. The Arab Spring is not very much flowering these days, and I think the individual country trajectories that are on this slide here are familiar to all of you. But I want to close on a positive note, so let me note two things about the Arab Spring and another point in conclusion. First of all, there is a country that has dramatically resisted the general trend in the region and is now moving, as I said earlier, with a general election to be held before the end of this year, toward becoming perhaps the first true, clear democracy in the entire post-colonial history of the Arab world, and that is Tunisia. It may only have 10 million people. It may not be representative in its class structure and level of development of a lot of other Arab countries, but frankly, the emergence of a serious, constitutional, law-based democracy with very competitive environment and electoral uncertainty and decent protection for liberties anywhere in the Arab world has the potential to become a model and a source of diffusion to the rest of the Arab world. And secondly, it's gotten virtually no attention in the Western press, overshadowed by so many other things that have been happening, including the appalling progression of military authoritarianism in Egypt, which is very, very disturbing in the extent of violations of political rights and civil liberties, and the apparent project that the Egyptian military has of controlling the political system indefinitely again. But there is another emerging, at least possible, semi-success story in the Arab world in an unlikely place, namely Yemen, one of the least developed countries in the region, which has walked back from the brink of civil war and with very skillful and subtle UN mediation reached a framework for a constitutional agreement between the North and the South and a diverse array of other actors that could result in a constitutional, at least semi-democracy, that might offer hope for the country progressing in a consensual fashion. This is just the trends in terms of the data. And finally, some reasons for hope. There are countries that are moving to or have moved to consolidate democracy. There has been political reform in places that were written off as almost democratic basket cases, like the Philippines. And I think the Philippines under Benigno Aquino shows what a difference good and responsible leadership can make to solving a country's governance problems and regional and identity divisions. I think Ukraine is going to return to democracy, but obviously in a very perilous geopolitical situation. There is a political transition underway in Burma. I can speak about it if you're interested. Right now, it's not going to result in a democracy because the military has put so many undemocratic provisions in the Constitution, but at least it's going to be a more pluralistic system than the country has had before. And finally, don't assume the inevitable stability of even the authoritarian success stories, precisely because of their success in places like China and Vietnam developmentally, not to mention, of course, as I said earlier, Malaysia and Singapore, they're going to have to confront in the next 10 to 20 years much more demanding, pluralistic, informed, tech-savvy, internet-using generations who I think, of course, Sam, I'm treading on your territory now, are going to be more demanding of freedom and accountability. And I don't think these regimes can survive frozen in their current authoritarian state. So with that, thank you for your patience, and I'll be glad to take any questions you have.
Okay, thank you. As I said, how fortunate we are to have you here. Not only my colleagues from faculty are here, our dean is here today too, Ambassador Hill. And so for those who don't know, we have an ambassador on the campus here who were ambassador to South Korea. He knows all about East Asia, so we are so fortunate to have ambassador here. Do you want to say a few words before we open up?
No, I think why don't you just, you're on a roll.
Okay, thank you. So I'm honored to be on a roll. Okay, so I see many hands. We open the floor, but try to be really brief and with a question mark. No time for statement. Try to be within 1 minute. So I'll start from my colleague here.
It's been official U.S. policy to promote the growth of democracy through the National Endowment for Democracies and so on and so forth. Would you say that all these efforts have been a miserable failure?
Did everyone hear the question? It is that we've had a policy now for some decades of promoting democracy, and for 30 years now, an institution or a family of institutions under the banner of the National Endowment for Democracy of assisting democratic development around the world. Have they been a miserable failure? And I would say by no means is that the case. I think you can point to a lot of instances where democratic assistance of a technical, financial, and political nature have helped to steer, encourage, or support transitions to democracy in South Africa and Poland and Chile and Central America. I think that Latin America's turn toward democracy owed something, maybe a lot, to the human rights policy that was introduced by Jimmy Carter during his presidency, which was a precursor to the more explicit democracy promotion policies that began under President Reagan. President Carter is really pilloried a lot now, and I think is inadequately appreciated for the turn that he made in American foreign policy, which I think helped to bring an end to military authoritarian rule in Latin America earlier than might have happened. There are many instances in the world, the Philippines in 1986, again Chile with the campaign for the no, where the application of diplomatic energy and initiative, Korea, I would say, with the protests in 1987 and the decision Chun Doo-hwan had to make about whether to repress, again, murderously these brave student protests or yield to the demand for direct elections, where American and in some cases European diplomatic initiatives really made a difference. This is very dramatically evidenced in George Shultz's memoirs, Turmoil and Triumph, where he speaks about the three cases of Chile, South Korea, and the Philippines. But this has gone on continuously. I would urge you or recommend to you and your students a book that I think is a fascinating set of case studies beyond the usual methods of financial, political, and technical assistance, of how diplomats can, in certain instances, make a difference through public diplomacy and through the initiatives they take on the ground and through the support they get in foreign policy with sanctions and so on, if they're carefully applied, in helping to support or steer countries toward democracies. If you just Google the Diplomat's Handbook, you'll get these case studies and general arguments.
Okay, Dan.
Maybe you could hand him the microphone so everyone
I
could
don't.
hear.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for your tour de force presentation. I was very pleased by your unambiguous characterization
of the situation in Egypt today as one of democratic backsliding and perilous authoritarianism. The obvious question following on the previous question is, what role has the United States played and what role could it play? Egypt is the second largest recipient of military aid from the United States in the world. We have a long-standing relationship with Egypt. What role would you like to see the U.S. play in this very disturbing development in Egypt?
Okay, let me just reflect on the history a little bit before I answer explicitly the last question of what should we do now. The unfortunate history is that the U.S. has, until the middle point of the George W. Bush administration, more or less uncritically accepted or embraced authoritarian rule in Egypt for strategic reasons. Egypt has been an important preserver of stability and peace with Israel and so on and so forth. And then as part of the initiative he launched after 2011, and particularly after September 2001, September 11th, and after the increasing crystallization of a strategy of trying to advance or promote democracy in the Middle East, whether you think it was clumsy or not, the Bush administration started putting pressure on the Mubarak regime. Then Obama came in, I think well-intentioned, a very decent man, but wanted to distinguish himself from George W. Bush. This often happens with American administrations. And so democracy promotion had in the minds of the American public been associated with the use of military force. There was already a kind of public angst or, discomfort with it. And Obama, he made some encouraging remarks in Egypt and Istanbul and so on, but he didn't really lean very heavily. And from what I understand, when the protests happened in Tahrir Square, there was a lot of debate in the Obama administration about whether to abandon Mubarak. And if you recall, if you look at a day-by-day trajectory of it, it wasn't immediately after January 25th, 2011. Now, then Mubarak falls. There is first a parliamentary election, then a presidential election. The Muslim Brotherhood comes to power. And we had been adjusting our policy, I think rightly and necessarily, to open a dialogue with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. They're an important actor in Egyptian political space. And to try and overcome the legacy of being identified with a secular military authoritarian regime or a civilian regime backed by the military, and be more open to different political actors. When the Brotherhood came to power in the form of President Morsi, I think we then leaned too heavily in the other direction. And there was very little criticism by the Obama administration or by our ambassador in Cairo of the increasing concentration and abuse of power by President Morsi and his Muslim Brotherhood government. And as a result, there was a lot of resentment of the United States. And there was a ludicrous conspiracy theory out there that we had helped to put the Muslim Brotherhood in power, that we were rooting for the Muslim Brotherhood, that they were our agents. I mean, how fantastic can conspiracy theories get? It doesn't get much better than that. But the point is that because of the lack of a clear, principled, guidepost throughout Egyptian history, that yes, we have a complex set of interests in the world. We can't simply have democracy and human rights be the only interests we pursue in the world, but this is something we care about, and we are going to criticize even our strategic allies when they violate these basic principles, and at least speak out for them in a consistent and clear fashion. Because of this, we've been shifting back and forth, embracing the government of the day, nervous about offending them because of, Israel, the Sinai Peninsula, the Suez Canal, all of these strategic interests in the region. And today we have zero credibility in Egypt. Everybody's mad at us. It's really astonishing. And so I'll just say there is a frightening turn to authoritarianism in Egypt that is going to be crowned with the electoral triumph of General al-Sisi in the coming presidential elections. And I think we have to speak out against it, and we have to impose consequences on it and try and limit it. But we've got to be careful, because the military in Egypt and the authoritarian leadership of Egypt have been, I think, incredibly artful at manipulating this now xenophobic nationalism to make the United States the enemy, even while they quietly do everything we want in the Sinai Peninsula. And you've seen that just today they have declared Hamas to be an enemy of the Egyptian state and so on.
Continue to receive our aid.
Yeah, it's brilliant. They do everything we want in a strategic sense, and they demonize us in the public space. And so I think if we cut aid to Egypt, it could play into this xenophobic nationalism and backlash. So what I would recommend doing is increasing economic assistance to send a message to the Egyptian people that we stand with them, possibly making some modest adjustment downward in military assistance, and maybe just moving, some few $100 million of the military assistance into economic assistance and possibly increasing it. But I think targeted sanctions on Egyptian elites and their families are something we need to look at. That's the principal tool I think we have.
Because this event is co-sponsored by Sie Center, so we need Middle East people here to ask questions later, and also Doc.
I'd love to hear your comments on the state of democracy in Turkey today, given all that's happened, given the backsliding. What's your analysis of that situation?
Well, it's probably very close to yours, I'm going to guess, which is that democracy has been deteriorating alarmingly in Turkey. There was a debate there's been a debate running ever since the Justice and Development Party came into power in Turkey, which is, I guess, a little more than 10 years ago now, about what it was and what it represented. And I don't think it's an Islamist party in the classic sense, but I do think it's a party with hegemonic pretensions. It's a conservative religious party that also happens to not want to have serious political competition, and that has moved in undemocratic ways. And I think the Ergenekon prosecutions of a wide swath of the military and civilian elite of the country, there is increasing evidence was simply engineered for political reasons to disable all of the opposition to the AK party. And Prime Minister Erdogan, I think, has increasingly been behaving in authoritarian fashion. Now, there's a truth moment coming, because according to the laws or rules of his own party, he can't have a third term as Prime Minister of Turkey. And so that's why he's been seeking to change the constitution to an executive presidential system. I think with the fracturing of his base of support and the recent cleavage within the kind of more moderately pro-Islamist camp, he's in real political difficulty now. And so he will probably not be able to change the constitution by democratic means. Maybe his power will begin to ebb. Maybe if Abdullah Gül becomes prime minister, we'll see again a more moderate and less abusive exercise of executive governmental authority. But, Turkey has the highest number of journalists in prison, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. Of course, you have to have some reasonable space for freedom of the press in order to have journalists in prison, because if you don't have any independent journalists, like in North Korea, then by definition there are no journalists in prison. But in any case, it's a worrisome situation. I think democracy is on the line in Turkey.
Okay, I think your pizza can buy only that far. Okay, so one more. Let's take two at one time, save time, to test Larry's memory. Okay, so Doug and Oliver.
You talk about history a lot, and I wonder, given the historically long time horizon required for successfully developing deep democratic institutions, whether this 13-year-long downward trend is more a drop in the bucket, sort of a growing pain stage for a longer-term development, whether you see it as a more pernicious trend.
Just second, Oliver.
Thanks, Professor Diamond. I want to follow up on Danny's question here, and so ask you if al-Sisi is elected as president of Egypt, would you consider that a return to democracy? And is there a tension between liberal democracy versus electoral democracy? Or is there a tension?
Okay, so let me come to your question first about Egypt's elections, and then I'll deal with the bigger question. There is not going to be a democratic election in Egypt soon for the presidency, because when a political party has been banned, persecuted, hounded, and completely routed from any right to contest in electoral space, then by definition you don't have a democratic election. This is beyond illiberal democracy. If everybody was allowed to compete and he was just kind of arresting a few too many people, we could call it illiberal democracy. But I think the control of the process, the control of the judiciary, the assault on civil society, which is very extensive, it's important to keep in mind it's not only the Muslim Brothers and other kind of Islamist-leaning political and civic forces that are being arrested and tortured mercilessly by this military regime. It's broad swaths of secular civil society too. They don't want any opposition. And maybe, they'll allow a few sacrificial lambs to surface and humiliate themselves in a contest in which General al-Sisi is probably going to win 70% of the vote. But this is just a ludicrous farce. It's not even close to being a set of circumstances that can qualify as a democratic election. Now to the larger and more historical and very interesting question. Well, you know me, I'm an optimist. So I think that I wrote an essay before The Spirit of Democracy under the title Universal Democracy, which predicted that the whole world would become democratic someday. So there's my bottom line answer to your question. It's just a question of how long is it going to take. I realize it's not likely to happen in my lifetime, but I will make a prediction. It's maybe a prediction or a bias for hope about my own longevity. I do think China will become a democracy in my lifetime. And let's face it, if that happens, that's a pretty big swath of the remaining slice of humanity that's living in non-democratic circumstances. I think we're running through a rough patch here. It may be longer, it may be shorter, depending on the policies of the established democracies in two respects. Number one, to embrace, support, stand in defense of, and facilitate the growth of democratic movements and institutions. And number two, I cannot stress this enough. I think it's the single most important thing we can do now to repair the quality of our own democracy. It is a really sorry spectacle to see what's happening in Washington, D.C. now in terms of paralysis, deadlock, polarization, and the growth of a variety of forms of soft corruption. This is why the last chapter of my book, The Spirit of Democracy, is called Physician, Heal Thyself, and is about the United States. But we know that Western European democracies, not to mention many of the former communist democracies of Central and Eastern Europe, especially Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania, are in pretty worrisome state right now. So I'd say the overriding obligation is to repair, reform, renew, revitalize, deepen, and further democratize our own democracies. And then they will become shining examples, hopefully, that will renew the global legitimacy of democracy. This is not in tension with or a substitute for trying to assist and support democratic development around the world through aid and diplomacy and so on. But I think it's going to be a matter of time. This could go on for a number of more years. But I think the momentum is going to shift back, and maybe dramatically, within 5 to 7 or 8 years.
Okay, so for the time's sake, we can only take 3 questions.
Take them all then.
So you give them all together. If he can remember any of them, he will answer them.
Oh,
if he does not, you will not get any answer. Then you can buy his books. So that's the deal. Okay, 3, I want to have a student over there. Okay, the second, let me see who, another student here.
What gives you hope for China's transition to democracy, and how do you see that developing in the next decade?
Okay, the third lucky person here.
So you talked about democracy or the transition in Egypt under Morsi and then also post-Morsi, post-July 3rd. I'm wondering if you could talk about the role that Egyptian liberals or those who call themselves liberals in Egypt have played since February 11th, 2011. And then kind of to piggyback on that, if you feel their role has been deleterious, is it possible, kind of thinking more big picture, is it possible for democracy to emerge in societies like Egypt, where it appears that significant proportions of the population are fundamentally anti-democratic, at least in their attitudes?
Well, let me take maybe it will surprise you that I'm going to do this, but let me take the Thailand and Egypt questions together, because I think there is a thread that runs through the 2 cases. And that is, I must confess, as a liberal myself, I mean, who are my personal friends in Egypt and in Thailand? They are the liberals, okay? The liberals you are criticizing, quite fairly, in my view, or by implication criticizing with your question. And the liberals who are mainly in the pro-monarchy, pro-yellow shirt Democratic Party camp. It is the case, and it is kind of, you'll see a kind of trajectory moving backwards in history, deeply backwards in history, of liberal skepticism and nervousness on, I'd say, class-based terms about the unwashed masses, coming in from the countryside in northern and northeastern Thailand and coming in from the slums of Cairo or Upper Egypt or wherever, and kind of overwhelming the more sober, refined, informed, liberal, and secular values of this urban elite. It's really actually a pretty old story in history. And I think that even though they're our friends, we need to hold them accountable and basically say, we in the United States and Europe and so on, look, A, you've got to take the long term here. And B, there are no shortcuts to democracy. And if you want to uphold liberal values, you can't be hypocritical about it. You can't have liberal values of freedom of the speech and personal security for middle-class people who identify with the West culturally and so on, and then say, well, it's okay to arrest and torture these dangerous Muslim brothers and poor people who've come out of the slums and lack the kind of refinement and Western education of these other groups. So to answer your question more explicitly, I think that we have to disaggregate Egyptian liberals. Generally, I'd say they are politically weak and they were poorly organized politically in terms of party support and so on. We always knew they were going to be at a massive electoral disadvantage. And In part, this is a question of time because the trajectory of Egyptian authoritarianism advantaged the Muslim Brothers and other groups that could kind of organize in the underground, organize in the shadows, in the interstices of the space that Mubarak left open during those years of authoritarian rule. And he knew how to manipulate the Islamist threat in a carefully calibrated way. I think they needed a longer time perspective, and some of them have been acquiring it. But I wouldn't put them all in the same camp, okay? So let me just make a distinction between a number of my friends who will go unnamed, who I think deserve to be very criticized as a group for basically continuing to embrace General al-Sisi and to justify not only the military coup, but a very widespread and murderous, it's really been murderous, over 1,000 people have died in political violence since the coup, crackdown on political opposition and civil society. And others, maybe a smaller number, but it's not zero, including my friend and colleague Amr Hamzawi, who've been quite critical of the military and now prevented from leaving Egypt, being prosecuted on, trumped-up charges. And so there's a process, I hope, of political learning that will go underway, and the realization by Egyptian liberals that, yes, if there's a Muslim Brotherhood government and it abuses power, protest against it, challenge it, expose it, but you've got to, have a guiding light, like I said, of consistency in terms of the political equality of all individuals and the embrace of rules of the game that are going to apply to everyone. And if you're in the minority, and I would say this for the yellow shirt camp in Thailand as well, you don't get to say, well, then we need to suspend elections until we're strong enough or can figure out a way to structure them so that we can win them. Play the democratic game, play it for the long run, build up your strength, and meet them on the electoral battlefield. It will take a while, but these people will make mistakes. Morsi was making them and losing a huge amount of support as a result that will eventually undermine their hold. And there's always the tools of peaceful civil disobedience to challenge this as well. And so I think what's happened in Thailand is just an absolute tragedy. And I don't absolve Thaksin of blame. He was an incipient authoritarian leader himself, and a deeply, profoundly corrupt one. I think he only came to power as a result of the corrupt subversion of the Constitutional Court, which was about to rule that he was ineligible to become prime minister until, to put it politely, it was subverted by his money. I guess I haven't been polite, but anyway, I'm not a diplomat and probably never will be. But, there needs to be dialogue and agreement on the rules of the game. You look at the democracies that have successfully emerged, and I think Tunisia is a very instructive example here, because it is about to really emerge and take a step forward, I think. And you had polarized political forces who stepped back from the brink and made compromises on the rules of the game going forward. I have a lot of respect for Rashid Ghannouchi for pulling his party, because they weren't all in favor of this course, in the direction of moderation and compromise and a lot of political sacrifices in terms of their agenda, and for the secular forces in Tunisia for agreeing with this as well. The final question about China and its democratic path. I wish that Xi Jinping and the Chinese political leadership would just kind of borrow a page from the KMT in Taiwan and say, well, we got a process of development going on economically. We live in a globalizing world. We've read a little bit of Seymour Martin Lipset, and so we can't dismiss modernization theory. We can't sit on this, dynamic social situation with this archaic and closed political system indefinitely. So we'll gradually open up. I mean, it took 30 years in Taiwan of gradually expanding the scope for First non-party competition, then party competition. First at the local level and gradually moving up. First some space for civil society, then greater space for civil society. I'm not saying, I don't think it's realistic to suggest to President Xi that, in 2 years China should be an electoral democracy like Taiwan. I mean, I don't think it's realistic. But if they had a plan for political reform, I think it would allow for political evolution in a way that would preserve stability and, frankly, probably give the Chinese Communist Party more time in power than personally I think it's going to have as a result of its absolute refusal to engage in any serious political reform. I wish that would happen. I don't see any evidence that it's going to happen. I see lots of evidence of economic reform, crackdown on corruption, and so on. I just don't think it's going to be enough. I think without political accountability and the gradual introduction of really serious political competition, and competitive village elections at this point in China's history is not really serious political competition. They're just not going to be able to get a grip on the abuse of power, the lack of accountability, the growing corruption that is increasingly frustrating and disillusioning a lot of Chinese. And that doesn't mean that the regime is going to fall tomorrow, but it means that it's an accident waiting to happen because it rests purely on a base of performance legitimacy. And when that goes, there's going to be nothing left.
On that note, in fact, talking about Taiwan, 6 years ago, we were together for that election. Ma Ying-jeou got into the power. We bet who have the closest number to the vote he got. I win. They put all 100 new Taiwan dollars. Remember that? You do remember?
What I remember is a group of political scientists sitting around the table.
I won.
You won?
Yes, you put $100. Everyone at the World Trade Center. Yeah, yes. Everyone put that. I put the number closest to what he got.
Yes. Okay, so you won that, and 4 years before, this is going to be very embarrassing because it's going to make me look like a betting person, and I'm really not. But 4 years before, there was another group of political scientists sitting around the table in 2004. In the year 2000, when Chen Shui-bian was running for the first time in a three-cornered race. 10 people around a table in a Chinese restaurant. There were 9 male political scientists and Chu Yunhan's wife. And guess who won the pool?
Yunhan's wife.
Correct.
Yes. She's Yunhan, talking about Yunhan, our mutual friend. You met him. He's the president of the Jiang Jingguo Foundation in Taiwan. You mentioned several surveys, Asian Parameter Survey. That's what he is putting together. There's a group of articles from that survey is going to be published in our journal. Wonderful. So advertisement. Look for that. Those articles are very good articles. Correct. Yes. And also, before we thank the speaker and you, we have this is our last event for this quarter, and we have scheduled several events for the next quarter. Next month, we have UPS, Global Corporation President CEO, coming talk about doing business between China and the U.S. In fact, she was the USTR person negotiated China's entry into WTO. So good person, look forward for our announcement. And also we put together a conference in May, rethinking the Chinese world order, historical perspectives on the rise of China. We got quite a few people from Washington and also from other parts. Yale professor, a professor from Yale, and also from U.S. Senate, China person, and also from Ronald Reagan appointee, Assistant Secretary of State. He's China person too. So we have a good people coming, looking for our announcements. Here now, I want to thank everyone coming. In particular, I want to thank my colleagues from the faculty because they are not here very often. So when Micheline there, I saw her and also see several of them. this is really something I want to be very grateful for colleagues coming to colleagues events. And also, I want to thank our dean, Ambassador Hill. In fact, at the very beginning, I mentioned that they should ask for our dean for the reimbursement because he went to Iraq, did not get money back. That's what we said at the very beginning.
I've forgotten about it.
I still remember that. So at that time, our dean was a State Department. So he's a part of those people who were responsible for that in any case. Thank you all for coming. And also, please join me to thank Dr. Larry Diamond for that wonderful presentation. Okay, thank you.